He was from the Vendée.
You're doing well. Oh, yeah.
I just remembered.
Okay, two more questions for you. In 1918, the President of the Republic, the head of state of France, was Raymond Poincaré. Where was he born? Which region?
Normandy sounds kind of logical.
Yeah.
What's the answer?
The answer is D, Meuse.
Oh, it was. Okay.
So Meuse, which is part of the old Lorraine, and so there were some. The story is that when he was a boy, he'd seen the Prussians come through his hometown in Lorraine, and when they defeated France in 1870.
Yeah.
Okay, one last question for you, and then then I can take questions and we can talk about the presentation further. Okay, this also happened in 1918. So, who did the Royal Air Force officially credit with shooting down the German flying ace Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, over France in 1918?
D. Well, the British. Oh, wait a minute. You said the British.
So the question is, who got the official credit for shooting down the Red Baron?
It wasn't good. I think it was Brown, and then Billy Bishop. No, that's wrong.
My first guess is Brown.
Yeah, he was a Canadian.
Okay, so the answer is yes. Brown, Arthur Roy Brown, Canadian, was officially credited. So he was also a pilot, and he was officially credited with having shot down the Red Baron. And now, apparently, after many years after the war, people started researching that, and some people. So there's various theories about who really killed the Red Baron. Some people believe it was he was actually killed by a shot from the ground, by soldiers. And so Popkin and Evans were soldiers. I think one of them was in the Australian Army, another was in the British Army. And some theories even argued that he'd been killed by another German plane by mistake. So we've never. So there isn't a definitive answer as to who really killed the Red Baron, although at the time Arthur Roy Brown was officially credited with shooting down the Red Baron.
How about Snoopy?
I was just thinking about Snoopy.
Okay, so I'd like to open it up to any questions or comments. So we still have, it's 5 minutes past 7, so we still have a bit of time before the hour runs out, and I'd be happy to, if you have any questions or perspectives, it'd be great to hear, yes.
Have a comment.
Yes, Cam, go ahead.
You talked about the mutiny in the French army.
Yes.
And it did in fact occur. But there's a Canadian connection here.
Okay.
And what it is, it's the Battle of Passchendaele. Because Sir Arthur Currie, who by this time had gained fame as the general who was in charge of the Battle of Vimy, he was ordered by Haig to take Passchendaele after the British and the French failed to do so. He refused. Interestingly, he refused. However, he was told that he had to do it for reasons that were not they were not able to tell why. And so he proceeded, he predicted that it would be 16,000 casualties, and there were 16,000 casualties. The Canadians eventually did take Passchendaele, but the reason he was not told is because of the mutiny. In other words, the Allied forces did not want the word to get around that the French army had mutinied. It's a bit of a connection.
Yeah, great comment. Yeah, the British were worried about the mutinies of the French army, and the Allies were lucky that the Germans did not hear about the full extent of the mutinies, because if the Germans had heard about it, they would have attacked and yes, perhaps with success. So yeah, it was a very worrisome development. The French. So in the spring, around the spring of 1917, many French soldiers were started to express their anger at how their leaders were conducting the war, and how many of them felt that they were being sent they were being used for senseless offensive operations that had no chance of success. And so many soldiers in many divisions refused to obey orders, and they were also unhappy about living conditions in the trenches, of course. So the French government was worried, and Philippe Pétain was the person the general who was called in to try to quiet down and control the mutinies. So it was a very worrisome development in 1917 for the French. Yes, sir.
Was there any awareness in France at the time how this German that's why we lost the war. The soldiers never lost the war. Was there any awareness of that? Also in regard to after the Second World War, the Allied forces, the Allied powers really encouraged German democracy. But after the First World War, there didn't seem to be enough sentiment so much.
It's a good question. I think there are different perspectives on that. In the and from the French perspective, I don't know to what extent there was an awareness. Now, the French leadership, so the French government, the Chamber of Deputies, the French politicians, most of them were, when the war ended, were actually their mentality was, we want Germany to pay. Like we were unfair. Their perspective was that we were unfairly attacked in August of 1914. Our country was invaded. Our northeast provinces were completely devastated. Millions of our soldiers died, and so we want Germany to pay. We want Germany to pay reparations, and we don't care how. So I think on the French side, the official, the dominant official approach was to make Germany pay, and they didn't pay. In fact, Foch and other French leaders, the more nationalist French leaders, were thinking about breaking up Germany. So Germany had been united in 1871, where before there'd been all the smaller states, Bavaria, Saxony, and of course, and the bigger state, Prussia. So some French leaders in 1919, like Foch said, we want to break up Germany, create 3 or 4 little states again, so Germany will not threaten France, not attack France ever again. And the British and the Americans were against that, partly because the British and Americans still wanted there to be a counterbalance to France in Europe. If Germany had been broken up into small pieces, France would have been by far the dominant country in Europe. And so Clemenceau also wanted to make sure Germany would never attack France again, but the most Clemenceau could do was to get Alsace and Lorraine back and to demilitarize the left bank of the Rhine for a few years, get commitments from defensive commitments from the United Kingdom and as well in case France were ever attacked again. And then in 1923, of course, Poincaré, when he was prime minister again, sent French troops to occupy the Rhineland because Germany was not paying reparations. So I think certainly in the early 20s, there may have been some. My impression is that some French leaders would have been more aware of the risks, the long-term risks of resentment in Germany, but the dominant trend among the French elite and French public opinion was Germany had to pay. Now I think in the late 20s and early 30s, when the economic situation started to improve, there was more openness towards some sort of reconciliation, both in France and to some extent, and also in Germany, with the Stresemann-Briand pacts in the late 20s. But of course, after the 1929 depression, that sort of went out the window as well in Germany. Yeah. So yeah, right after at 1918, right after the war, the dominant trend among French leadership was to make Germany pay, and I don't think there was really a concern about how the Germans felt. Yeah. Yes. Any other comment? Yes.
It's interesting to note that Germany was never invaded. It was never invaded in the First War. It was strictly an armistice. And so in effect, they did not surrender. And I think that speaks to this gentleman's point here, that perhaps there was an impression within certain people in Germany that they were in fact stabbed in the back, using the terms that you were using earlier about Clemenceau wanting retribution and gaining it to some extent. I think that because the Germans realized that they were never ever invaded. They invaded others, but they sure weren't invaded themselves. The whole war stopped before they were invaded.
Yeah, that's correct. The armistice, when the armistice was signed on November 11,
that's right.
The Allies had not yet entered Germany. Now, the reason the Germans signed the armistice was that they knew at that stage that with the British, the American, and the French armies being on the offensive and being larger and more powerful than the German army at that point, the Germans knew that if they continued the war, Germany would have been invaded. Mm-hmm. So the Germans decided to sign an armistice before Allied troops actually entered into Germany. So the Germans signed the armistice, and then of course later in 1919 the Germans had to, reluctantly from their point of view, they had to agree to the terms that the Allies demanded through the Versailles Treaty. Germany, on the Western Front, Germany was not actually invaded. Although the Allies were certainly getting, if the Germans had not signed the armistice in November of 1918, the Allies certainly would have invaded Germany. It's interesting that the Germans. The Germans who signed the armistice were not members of the German General Staff, so they sent civilians, and so in a sense, the German General Staff avoided. So Hindenburg, Field Marshal Hindenburg, avoided signing the surrender document. Yeah. Yes. Oh, there was a gentleman here. Yes.
I'd like to ask. I know during the Second World War, Portugal was a neutral country. I'd like to ask if you know, during the First World War, what was the situation about Spain and Portugal regarding France? They were friends or enemies?
Spain and Portugal regarding France?
During the First World War. Because Second World War, Portugal was neutral in Second World War. So I don't know what was the position of Portugal, for example, in the First World War.
Now, Portugal, it's a good question. I'm not entirely sure, but didn't Portugal send some troops in World War I?
Yes, they sent.
Yes,
I don't remember what side they were.
Portugal would have helped the Allies, not the Central Powers. So Portugal sent a few troops to help the Allies. And Spain was neutral. So Spain was neutral in World War I. Spain was definitely neutral. Yeah. I remember reading how. I lived as a child. I lived in Spain for many years. So I spent a long time in Madrid, and I remember also reading one time that Spain was neutral, but at the time there were reports that Spanish people who tended to be more liberal would generally be supportive of the Allies, whereas Spanish people who were more conservative were more sympathetic toward the Central Powers. So it's interesting how in a neutral country like Spain, there was, the people who were a little bit more liberal would be more, this is anecdotal, but it was a report that was written at the time. People who were more liberal would be more sympathetic with the United Kingdom and France, of course, with liberal democratic parliamentarian systems, and people who were more conservative would be more sympathetic toward the Central Powers. So of course, Germany and Austria-Hungary were a little more, were sort of semi-constitutional systems, conservative monarchies, although with functioning parliaments. Yes, and you had a question, yes.
What was the situation with the government in Germany at the time of the armistice? Hadn't it largely collapsed?
Yes, the Kaiser abdicated, I think, November 9 or something like that. So the Republic had been already proclaimed in Berlin. Yes, by the time when the armistice was signed, Germany was in complete chaos. The Republic had been proclaimed, but there was really no there was no actual. Nobody really knew what the new regime or the new government would look like. The Reichstag was still there, so that there would have been deputies, and one of the people who signed the armistice for Germany was a deputy in the Reichstag, but Germany was in a chaotic system, yes, and of course nobody really knew whether Bavaria, for example, would try to secede again, or would Germany stay together. Nobody at that point, nobody was really sure either. And also with Germany, and on the German side, there was also concern that how would the army react? Would the German army accept the armistice? Would the German army come back home peacefully? What would the German army in Eastern Europe do? So there were many questions, very much, many things were very much in the air. And yes, the Kaiser was already on his way to Holland, or had arrived there, and so very chaotic situation in Germany, yeah. And yes, and also the German General Staff wanted to avoid signing the armistice. They wanted the civilians to some extent be the public faces for that. So yeah, yes, sir.
Yeah, in Germany there was actually a socialist uprising, and it was the Social Democrats took over the Republic, and they called in the Free Corps, which were sort of fascist soldiers still, and they had them shoot in Berlin on the workers, and it was thrown down by the Social Democrats, which is a real tragedy in German history, not a failed revolution.
Well, that's correct. And the role of the Social Democrats in Germany was interesting because in before the war started, the Social Democrats were already the single largest party in the German Reichstag. Now, in 1914, when the war started in August, all Social Democratic deputies in the Reichstag voted in favor of the war loans, funding the war at the start. So the German Social Democrats, by and large, at that time, were becoming more moderate, and and so the majority of them, for most of the war, supported the war effort. Although of course they eventually developed some doubts, and there was some movement within Germany toward some voices advocating a negotiated peace settlement. But yeah, and I think so German Social Democrats they were supportive of the German government when the war started. Any other questions, comments?
Just another one. Was not one of the factors in the agreement to come to the armistice, or to at least negotiate an armistice, was that not the reason? The reason was that people in Germany were starving to death, essentially. I mean, the economy of Germany, the civilian economy, was in ruins. And everything that the government of the day, the Kaiser's government, if I can put it that way, they were just pushing all the money and everything toward the army, and to some extent the Navy, because the submarine fleet was quite large at that time. But I'm saying that within the country itself, the morale of the country was at rock bottom, even though the German army existed on the backs, if you will, of the people in terms of its support for armaments and things of that nature.
Yeah, it's correct that the German, that by 1918 the German population was having a very difficult time.
Sure.
In addition, of course, to the large casualties, the German army was suffering. There was a blockade, so very limited. So there was a limit on supplies and foodstuffs that could arrive in Germany. So there was massive starvation as well. So many, yes, you may have heard that many German families had to subsist on turnips, right? Bread was no longer available, so they had to use turnips instead. Now in 1918, one of the things that tipped the balance was that in July and in August, the British, American, and French armies started to make these breakthroughs through the German line.
Mm-hmm.
And so they were using tanks, they were using, of course, they were using some new technology. The German army was not large enough to fight the armies of 3 countries. And so there were some German leaders, some German military leaders were thinking of continuing to resist. They could have kept fighting, maybe retreating to the German border or to the Rhine, and kept fighting from there. But Germany decided to sign the armistice so that Germany would not be invaded. And there we can see how the German leadership in World War I, even at the end, was different from the German leadership in World War II. So the German leadership in World War I, the provisional government, the provisional Republican government in Germany, and the Reichstag, and even the military, were still rational in the sense that, knowing they were probably going to lose, they decided to sign the armistice and surrender. Whereas in World War II, of course, the German leadership at that time continued fighting regardless of the odds and regardless of the impact and destruction that was brought to Germany. So quite a different approach by the German leadership in the 2 wars. Yes?
Which country used Neurogas first?
The question?
Yeah, I think, from what I've read, it was actually used to a small extent in the Eastern Front, actually, against the Russians by the Germans in maybe early 1915, to a small extent. So to my knowledge, it was the Germans who used it first in the Western Front, mustard gas. Yeah, but I think
It was in April of 1915.
April 1915. Yeah. Any other questions or comments?
Just a note to this thing about the termination of the war. Of course, in World War II, there was a no unconditional surrender edict on the Western Allied side. Whereas World War I, that wasn't the case. It was possible to negotiate an armistice.
Yeah, that's fair.
The policies are different even amongst the Western Allies during World War I, much more accommodating to things. And the armies of the West were in a near state of collapse as well. You're talking about the American armies, arguably the Canadians and Australians were pretty strong, but French and British armies were flat on their backs, almost as badly off as the German armies. So I think everybody probably wanted that into it.
In World War I.
Yeah, it's a very different situation.
Is there's no question that with the Americans coming in, it made a huge difference. You're absolutely right. And the British Army was on its back as well as the French.
I also tried, of course, 100 years later, it's difficult for us we can't be there. It's difficult for us to know what people were going through, but I sometimes try to think about what the French civilian population was going through throughout that year. So I think we can, if we try to put ourselves in their shoes, if we try to imagine ourselves as French civilians, we can see that many people are missing. So many men, of course, are either at the front. Many have been killed. Many have been permanently injured, wounded. So that's, of course, very tragic and sad. Now, in 1918, though, so 1918, of course, for the French was not all sad. So there was, of course, a lot of there were still casualties. There was still fighting. But there was some, from the French perspective, there was some good news. So they eventually won the war. The Americans started arriving in large numbers to support the Allied effort. From July, the Allies start winning all these victories against the Germans on the Western Front. So that would have been a positive. And if we can look on YouTube and find these old newsreels of 1918 in France, and we see all these celebrations, people on the street welcoming the Americans, people on the street celebrating the Armistice Day, the end of the war. So 1918 for French civilians was, I think, yes, perhaps bittersweet to some extent. On one hand, there's still a lot of fighting, a lot of suffering, but on the other hand, things, after 4 years of effort, things start to look up for the French in 1918. In previous years, it was not certain that France would win the war. It was not certain that France would be able to get back Alsace-Lorraine. And so 1915, 16, 17, nobody really knew what the outcome would be. But in 1918, things for France start to look up, in spite of all the ongoing suffering and difficulties. For the French civilians, there were economic difficulties. There was some rationing. There was some increased taxation. There was a lot of hard work to supply munitions and to make sure the armies were on the field were well supplied. Now, French and British civilians overall did not go through the same level of hardship that civilians in Germany or Austria-Hungary did. So civilians in Germany and Austria-Hungary were to a large extent completely cut off from international trade, from trade with other European countries during the war, partly by the British Navy. Whereas civilians in Britain and civilians in France, in spite of some rationing, they still had some, of course, contact with international trade, with the United States, with South America, with international markets. In terms of finances, France, of course, France had to issue many calls had to issue many war bonds, so hoping that the public would subscribe to war bonds that the government could use to finance the war. France, of course, also had to borrow money from Britain and borrow money from the United States, and so that did add a huge load to the French government debt. And that was part of the reasons why the French were so adamant that Germany pay reparations to France, partly to help France pay back its loans that it owed to the UK and to America. So 1918 for the French civilians, yes, there was of course ongoing bad news and ongoing suffering, but some good news starts to trickle in as well in terms of progress, in terms of the war, of course, the war ending by the end of the year. There was some. I remember reading a novel. I think the title of the novel was 1914 about this novel looks at the experience of ordinary French people during the war, and The novel talks about also how some people in France and other countries too as well profited from the war. So some people who owned munitions factories or were suppliers to the army actually got rich. And so while in war, while most people suffer, some people to some extent benefit in some way or another. Now, French leaders also, so for example, Marshal Foch, the French Allied, Supreme Allied commander, his son-in-law had been killed at the start of the war. So leaders also had experienced suffering at the personal, family level sometimes, yeah. Any other questions or comments? Thank you very much. Thank you for coming, everyone. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Good talking to you.
Huh?